600. We haven't been able to dispatch anybody yet.
316 dispatch. 601 established command at 6th and Harvey.
On April 19th, 1995, as many people were starting their workday, a beautiful spring morning in the heartland became chaos when at 9:02 a.m., explosions tore through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City.
An explosion at 9 o'clock this morning that did that damage you're looking at right there, blowing off the entire north face of that building.
The federal building located 200 North West 5th Street was almost completely destroyed.
A terrible tragedy has occurred here in Oklahoma City.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens.
168 people were killed in the blast and over 800 wounded. The hospitals were overrun with casualties. A rescue worker was killed from falling debris within the first few hours. But what would sear the bombing in the hearts of Americans was the 19 children inside the daycare center in the building who had lost their lives.
The most beautiful memorial left by anyone is not in the rubble of this building, but in the hearts and the lives that knew them and loved them. We come today to remember their lives, and we come today to offer thanks. Thanks for the hundreds and hundreds of people who were involved in the rescue and recovery efforts.
6 years before 9/11, it was the first mass casualty terrorist attack on American soil. The prologue to a new chapter in American history had been written in blood, fear, and shock. Terrorism had struck home. From now on, nothing would be the same again.
We know that more than McVeigh and Nichols were involved.
There were questions of other bombs being found at the scene of the crime, witnesses to the bombing.
The FBI, like any government agency, is more concerned with power, prestige, maintaining its position, rather than truth and justice.
Based on the damage pattern to the building, what the government says is impossible.
That life we had back before the bombing, that life is over.
For the first time in my fight with the government, they stepped forward and said it would pose a grave risk to the national security of the United States of America if we release these CIA documents.
If you know the truth will set you free.
You've got to band together, or it's over for all of us. The man on top will get you.
If we don't expose the fact that Oklahoma City stinks to high heaven, the same people that carried it out are going to do it over and over and over again, and they're going to use these frightening events to drive a stake through the United States and kill our republic.
Almost immediately, the Oklahoma City Police Department announced a be-on-the-lookout alert for two Middle Eastern-looking suspects wearing blue jogging suits. Shortly before the bombing, they were seen by a witness running from the Murrah building and getting into a brown pickup truck, then driving away from the scene of the crime. It was soon determined that a truck bomb had exploded directly outside the building. Approximately 200 feet from the bomb crater, a VIN number stamped on a twisted axle identified the vehicle as a Ryder rental truck.
Two suspects are in custody this evening in the bombing of Oklahoma City's Murrah Federal Building.
Shortly after the bombing, a 26-year-old U.S. Army veteran, Timothy McVeigh, was pulled over by an Oklahoma Highway Patrol officer 60 miles north of Oklahoma City. He was stopped for speeding in his car without a license plate. McVeigh would admit to carrying a concealed handgun and was taken into custody without incident. It was the first time Timothy McVeigh had been arrested in his life. The original alert for two Middle Eastern males had been rescinded within hours of the bombing, and the identification number on the Ryder axle was traced to a rental agency in Kansas. The renter had given a false name, but had listed his address as a farmhouse in Michigan belonging to James Nichols. James's brother, Terry Nichols, was a friend of Tim McVeigh from their time in the U.S. Army. Upon hearing the news that he was wanted for questioning in the bombing, Terry Nichols turned himself in to the Harrington, Kansas Police Department. Within 24 hours after the attack, the FBI had received a tip from a former co-worker of Tim McVeigh in Buffalo, New York. The tipster informed the FBI that McVeigh had often espoused militant anti-government views and that McVeigh was very angry over the siege of the Branch Davidians by federal agents in Waco, Texas, which had ended in a catastrophic fire 2 years to the day before the Oklahoma City bombing.
That Friday, they showed the FBI bringing Tim McVeigh out of the jail in Perry, Oklahoma. And that's when I got angry, when I saw that it was an American and it was a Middle Easterners. I had a hard time accepting the fact that that Americans would do that. Americans are supposed to love their children. They are not supposed to murder their children.
Shaken, disillusioned, angered that could happen in this country.
Upon learning that McVeigh was already in jail, the FBI transferred him to federal custody, and an indictment was issued against Tim McVeigh, Terry Nichols, and others unknown for the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building. Another Army buddy of McVeigh's, Michael Fortier of Kingman, Arizona, was later arrested and charged with having advanced knowledge of the bombing plot.
The last thing I remember was being thrown to the center of that room and looking up and looking into the sky, and there was no roof, and everything was just suspended up in the air in the sky.
When I came to, I stood up, I was facing the south, but all the light was behind me. And I turned and looked back to the north, and the whole front of the building's gone. I'm about 4 to 5 feet from where it dropped off.
On the morning of April the 19th of 95, my dog, Gunny, and I arrived at the scene of the Murrah building. There was a great deal of chaos at the scene. A lot of people bleeding, screaming, running away from the building.
I lost my 2 grandchildren. They were in the daycare center at the Murrah building. Their names were Aaron and Elijah Coverdale. Aaron was 5 years old. Elijah was 2. I was living at the Regency when the bombing happened. And that morning I was at work. I had custody of Aaron and Elijah, so they lived with me. And I had dropped them off at the daycare center that Wednesday morning. I'd get up in the middle of the night and get in the shower and turn the water on so people wouldn't hear me screaming. And I'd just scream at God and ask him what was wrong. Why were we being punished so?
I knew the Coverdale boys, Elijah and Aaron. These 2 boys, they were characters. They, me being single and living in this apartment, I was kind of a party guy at that time, 27 years old. At one point in time, I had promised these 2 boys that I was going to give them some toys. And the problem with that, living in the Regency, on the 18th floor, you leave something in your car, you don't want to go back down and get it because it's just a hassle unless it's ice cream. And so I left these toys in the car for the longest time, and I never did get them those toys until, after they passed away, when I gave them to Janie.
Well, then I got watching the stuff down on the street, kind of got mesmerized by what was going on down on the street. While I was standing up there was a little girl that was taking a photography class at UCO that took a picture of the building, and I was in that picture.
You could not see anything in front of you. The smoke was so thick and so black. And the only thing I can tell you is it smelled like sulfur. If you were in a chemistry lab, it smelled like sulfur. And she said, "You can't go that way." And I said, "Why?" She said, "There is nothing out there. It's gone."
The reasons for the bombing, the perpetrators, the rumors, and the suspects change depending on whose viewpoint you take. Like all controversial events, some of those closest to the event and farthest away are bound together by their questioning of the official story. The first questions were directed at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which had launched the raid on the Branch Davidians. The Oklahoma City office for the ATF was located in the Murrah building and was the supposed target of the attack. Yet, no agents were killed or seriously wounded. Was the ATF office empty that morning?
I asked him if I could speak with an ATF officer that worked in the building so I could find out if they knew anything about my wife. And he told me that they were in debriefing and I asked him, you know, I need to talk to one of them. I need to find out something. And he said that none of them had been in the building, so they weren't hurt. They had been tipped by their pagers that morning not to come into work.
The ATF told several different stories to explain their agent's curious absence. The most fantastic story was that 2 agents were indeed inside the building and were heroes that day. ATF agent Luke Franey claimed that he was knocked unconscious by the blast and, after an aborted helicopter rescue, crawled onto an outside ledge to escape his office. Franey reported that he then used his martial arts skills to break through several walls and injured his hand. Another agent, Alex McCauley, claimed that he was in an elevator at the time of the bombing. After free-falling for 5 floors, McCauley supposedly broke out and rescued several people.
My crews were the crews working on the Murrah building the day of the bombing. Immediately after the bombing, they called me on the radios, and at that point, they were going in to assist with, because the fire department hadn't even got there yet, they were going to check to make sure all the elevators were clear. They weren't aware, because they were coming from the south side, that the building on the north side was gone. So they went in to check the elevators, and that's when they found out how bad the damage was inside the building. None of the elevators went to free fall because the governor overspeeds were not tripped. The safety mechanisms on the bottom of the elevators were not tripped, so none of the elevators had a free fall condition. I think it was McCauley indicated that they were trapped in an elevator. So at the grand jury investigation, once I got the FEMA report that showed which elevator they were in, I said that there's no possible way they could have been in that elevator because my men checked it and it was still locked from the top, and the doors were, the wall had caved in against the doors between floors, so they couldn't have gotten out of the elevator without assistance.
Jane Graham worked in the building for over a decade, was vice president of the Federal Employees Union, and has testified before Congress on labor issues. She knew everyone in the building and bore witness to suspicious behavior that morning.
On the morning of the bombing, when my husband dropped me off and I got out of the car, as I was walking toward the entrance, there were 2 men standing directly in front of the double doors, and there was a little sitting area there, planter and so forth there in front. They were standing right there on the sidewalk. They had on ATF jackets, which said ATF on them. They were talking to a third gentleman who was dressed in business clothes. And I saw them, their backs were to me, and I thought, they don't normally, all of the people we see go up there to ATF and everything, they're never identifiable. They always are dressed, a lot of them look like drug people and other things, and, but they're certainly not dressed for you to be able to tell who they are.
A paramedic who responded to the bombing, Tiffany Bible, confirms that the ATF were not in their office and, in fact, may have been aware of some type of threat that day. In this affidavit, she states that immediately after the bombing, she asked an ATF agent on the scene if any of them were in the building. He responded, "No, we weren't in there today," and that the Murrah building was bombed because of Waco. She further states that within the first 20 minutes of the bombing, she saw at least 8 ATF agents outside the building in clean black jumpsuits. To this day, the ATF has been unwilling to address their prior knowledge of the bombing. Beyond the vague rumors of the significance of April 19th, some federal agencies were aware of an actual threat.
One of the most frustrating things about prior knowledge is that the media, some in the media and others would accuse us of saying that the government blew the building up, which we never said, and I do not believe.
The U.S. Marshals, responsible for security of federal personnel and facilities, warned that, quote, Islamic terrorists may be planning suicide attacks against federal courthouses and government installations, designed to attract worldwide press attention through the murder of innocent victims. The ATF had placed informant Carol Howe into a white separatist community in eastern Oklahoma called Elohim City. Another ATF agent admitted under oath that one suspect, Andy Strassmeyer, was reported to make, quote, threats to blow up federal buildings, unquote, before the Oklahoma City bombing. Furthermore, Carol Howe actually drove Strassmeyer and other suspects to Oklahoma City to scout bombing targets. Was this the source of the ATF's suspicious behavior the morning of April 19th? U.S. Representative Ernest Istook of Oklahoma also displayed advanced knowledge of the bombing.
To my left from the east, I saw Senator Istook kind of work his way west. Well, he came up to me and we started talking small talk, terrible thing and all this, and really didn't know what much to say. And he said, all of a sudden he made the comment, yeah, we knew this was going to happen.
I noticed the lady back behind me by a backhoe, they were taking pictures. She identified herself as an attorney, Lana Tyree, and she was with Ernest Istook. And she made a comment to me that Istook told her that they were aware of a bomb threat since April 9th. You didn't really think much about it until this grand jury and stuff started probing into it, and people were claiming that there wasn't any prior knowledge. I started thinking about it and got with Dave, and we put two and two together, and we said, hey, somebody knew about a prior bomb threat. This ought to be known.
Everyone who knows me knows I would not sit idle if I knew about a conspiracy of silence. I would never rest until such a conspiracy was exposed, but I know of no such conspiracy.
Istook has denied this evidence under oath, but he has never answered the Oklahoma County Sheriff's deputy's challenge to subject his opposing versions of prior knowledge to polygraph testing. Many witnesses have officially stated that the Oklahoma County Bomb Squad was conducting a search at the federal courthouse across the street from the Murrah building 2 hours before the attack.
Trish Nix, I ran into her. She was another employee there at HUD, and she had asked me if I had seen the bomb squad that morning, and I had said no. I wasn't aware that they had been in the building, and she said yes. She had seen their unit parked in the parking lot of the church across the street.
County Appraiser J.D. Reed saw the bomb disposal unit parked outside the courthouse that morning. Despite multiple eyewitnesses, the Sheriff's Department denies this claim.
If that building was under threat and they were getting bomb threats, and this was a daily thing or a weekly thing, or if they've gotten many threats or only one, the parents of the children in that daycare deserve to have been notified. People do not keep children in daycares where there are bomb threats made.
Under the pressure of mounting evidence, ABC's 2020 reported on many of these puzzling questions a year and a half after the bombing.
At issue increasingly for some of the victims and their families, what did authorities know or suspect before the explosion that federal workers and the children arriving at the Murrah building did not know or were not told?
There was this fairly large truck with a trailer behind it, and it had a shield on the side of the door, and it said bomb disposal or bomb squad below it.
Authorities now claim in federal investigative reports that the huge, ominous truck with its trailer was being used by a deputy to run routine errands. Other documents obtained by 2020 show that someone called the Executive Secretariat's office at the Justice Department in Washington and said the Murrah building had been bombed. But this was 24 minutes before the blast. No action was apparently taken.
According to the show's producer, the Justice Department actively intervened to prevent an in-depth follow-up to this segment from airing nationally.
2020 did a 15 or 20 minute segment on prior knowledge that was put together by a guy named Roger Charles. That was so explosive that he was putting together an entire hour or whatever for 2020, which he would tell you. But the feds came in and stopped 2020, wouldn't let them broadcast the larger segment that he put together concerning prior knowledge.
The news channel has learned of another strange development. Apparently, before the bombing, Governor Frank Keating's brother, Mark, had been working on a novel about a terrorist bombing in Oklahoma City. Stranger still, one of the characters in the novel was named Thomas McVeigh.
Despite the official denials, the evidence confirms that at least some amount of prior knowledge existed. More ominously, there are suggestions that certain government agencies were fully expecting a bombing to occur that day.
The Horse Patrol, interestingly, was a very small unit and was assisted by the county Reserve Mounted Patrol Unit. For whatever reason, on the morning of the bombing, they had been assigned and had already met at the Oklahoma City Equine Canine Facility and had prepared their horses, their tack, and uniforms to go downtown for crowd control. Rarely, very rarely would they go down and patrol or work the downtown area for crowd control for anything.
The importance of exposing prior knowledge cannot be understated. Those individuals who understood the danger beforehand and did nothing are just as guilty as those who lit the fuse on the bomb. As the FBI and Department of Justice narrowed its focus on Tim McVeigh as the lone bomber on April 19th, people seeking truth and justice for the dead were dismayed that so many reports of accomplices were being discarded by the federal authorities. The first sketches of the suspects released by the FBI clearly indicated that 2 people were involved in parking the Ryder truck in front of the Murrah building, and the original BOLA, or Be on the Lookout alert, had mentioned 3 suspects. When the hunt for John Doe number 2 was called off and he was dismissed as a ghost, people who knew for a fact that they had seen McVeigh with other people began to speak out. Did McVeigh act alone?
During that time, broadcasts were being made that there was suspects had been observed leaving the scene in a brown pickup.
At this time, people were trying to get together on who was going to do what, medical personnel and such. There was a police car sitting to my left, facing west on 5th Street. And as we were all standing there conversing and, people were doing what they were doing, it came out over the radio on this police car that they were looking for a brown truck, an APB for a brown truck. It was quick, but it was heard.
I haven't stopped asking questions because I know that we haven't been told the truth. I've talked to too many people that saw Timothy McVeigh that morning, saw Timothy McVeigh in Kansas and saw Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City. Not one person saw him by himself.
Timothy McVeigh stepped out of the truck. I walked him over to, let's say, 10, 11 feet away from the truck itself. I pointed a direction downtown, which is to my right. He seemed to acknowledge where I was talking about. At that time, the gentleman walked back to the truck. I talked to him. I also noticed there was a passenger in the truck at that time.
And mostly, it was a John Doe 2 thing, because as you remember, it was the greatest manhunt there's ever been. And then all of a sudden, hey, he doesn't even exist. If he doesn't exist, what was the deal about the manhunt? I mean, things like that. That was continually coming out.
I know for a fact Timothy McVeigh was with another individual on the morning of April 19th, right before the bombing.
Because the evidence is overwhelming and compelling that there were other perpetrators and they were not pursued. In the very early days after the bombing, the decision was made not to pursue any more of those individuals.
In the days before the bombing, Tim McVeigh was seen making preparations with other suspects, not Terry Nichols or Michael Fortier, but others unknown, whom the authorities seemed uninterested in finding.
Yeah, the man that I saw on the phone that day, that was actually on the phone, was McVeigh. I am 100% sure of that. He had a partner with him that had shoulder-length hair, that was leaned up against the wall facing him. Then at one point, he turned to the guy to his right, who was leaning against the wall, shoulder-length hair, and said, he told us to stay here. I did go up to the FBI at 50 Penn Place and told them my story. If I remember right, I think they actually sketched out the second person that I was describing, which was shoulder-length hair, tan, stocky build, a light plaid type jacket shirt kind of mix, kind of goofy looking guy.
A convenience store clerk reported to the FBI that McVeigh had purchased fuel for a Ryder truck at her store 2 days before the bombing, even pointing out on the register tape when the purchase was made. Accompanying McVeigh was another suspect. This example is only one of many eyewitness accounts that diverge from the official narrative. And although the government states that McVeigh never scouted inside the Murrah building, a Secret Service investigator reported that she had seen him in the building, also with a second suspect. The official narrative dictates that Tim McVeigh alone rented the Ryder truck in Junction City, Kansas on April 17, 2 days before the bombing. He and Terry Nichols supposedly constructed the bomb on April 18. But the bulk of eyewitness accounts assert that the Ryder truck was at Geary Lake for several days before that.
I retired April 11th, 1995, and after finishing up that morning, I decided to stop by here and fish at Geary State Lake, which is right in this general area here that I was fishing from, the pier or jetty. And I stayed here most of the afternoon fishing, of course, with no luck. And later on that afternoon, I had decided to maybe go back over this way over here to the other point back there and see if I'd have any luck. When I noticed a Ryder truck over there. I was sitting at home one day and my wife came in from work and she said that she had been stopped in a roadblock up here at Geary Lake in reference to the Oklahoma City bombing and the making of the bomb here at Geary State Lake and with a Ryder truck. And I said, well, you know, I had told you about the Ryder truck I had seen there before this. And that's how I became aware of it. And then the next thing I knew, she told the ATF and FBI, the people at the roadblock, that what I had seen. And before I knew it, my house was swarming with agents.
McVeigh stayed at the Dreamland Motel just outside the gates of Fort Riley, Kansas, while he rented the truck and built the bomb. Once again, eyewitnesses state that he was not alone, and the Ryder truck was there for days before the FBI insists it was. The maid at the Dreamland saw McVeigh's friend with the Ryder truck, and when shown a sketch of John Doe number 2, told the FBI, "My God, who did the sketch? It looks just like him." All these reports indicate that more than one Ryder truck was involved in the bombing, and more people than the government is letting on.
Justice for these killers will be certain, swift, and severe. We will find them, we will convict them, and we will seek the death penalty for them.
It was promised to the people of Oklahoma City and to the rest of America that every single person responsible for the bombing would be caught, tried, and held accountable for the harm they had inflicted. It was expected that this promise would be fulfilled. Nevertheless, as eyewitness testimony and other promising leads were being carelessly discarded, replaced only with the lies and inconsistencies of federal officials, a deep but private suspicion grew in the minds of observers that perhaps a government cover-up was underway. Was this mere incompetence, or was there something else at work here?
I was a police officer in the Tulsa Police Department for 27 years. And in 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, I was requested by the local FBI office through our chief of police to assist any way I could and look into the bombing, and using my contacts as an investigative journalist, which is what I did on the side, to try to find out anything we could find out about the bombing, McVeigh, Nichols, and just kind of follow the investigation any place it went, just follow the leads. I was still working the case with Janie Davis and David Hoffman, 2 Oklahoma City police officers, and one of them, it was one of the first ones in the building, and he saw some things in the building. He saw the biggest damage to the building was the pit, which was in the back of the building and went down like 2 or 3 floors. He saw all of that, you know. That never came out in the news. It wasn't part of the investigation. It didn't count. In other words, if it didn't fit the mold that the Department of Justice under Janet Reno set for the FBI, then it wasn't put in the case, period.
The FBI bragged about its handling of the deadliest terror attack in American history, but gigantic holes in the case were being ignored by the media. McVeigh was first suspected because he rented the truck under the name Robert Kling. One of the first pieces of evidence used to link McVeigh to the bombing was problematic.
I went to Junction City. I went out to Elliott's Body Shop, and I spoke to Mr. Elliott. I told him who I was, and I said, I would like for you to tell me what happened the day Tim came to rent the Ryder truck. And he said, you mean the day Tim and his friend came? And I said, Tim wasn't by himself? He said, no, ma'am.
The FBI has been designated by President Clinton as the lead federal agency in this investigation.
Incredibly enough, there remains an extra unidentified leg that was found in the rubble. Oklahoma State Medical Examiner Fred Jordan testified in court, "We had 8 people with traumatically amputated left legs. However, we have 9 left legs. We have 1 leg too many." Stephen Jones, McVeigh's defense attorney, detailed in his book, Others Unknown, the significance of this extra leg. Former chief pathologist for Northern Ireland T.K. Marshall performed over 2,500 autopsies on bombing victims and told Jones that, in all the years in Ireland, we identified every innocent person that was killed. There was never an unknown victim. The FBI collected 1,034 fingerprints during their investigation, but an agent admitted under oath that these prints were not run through the National Fingerprint Database. Nikki Deutschman was the jury foreperson for the federal trial of Terry Nichols.
I think that the government perhaps really dropped the ball. I think that there were a large number of sightings right around before, the week before, and the days and months after the bombing, and sketches of people that were recognizable. In this trial, there even was a photograph of someone who may have been involved with mixing the bomb, with putting the bomb together. And that person, it was a photograph from a newspaper. Obviously, that person's identity is known. I think there are other people out there, and decisions were probably made very early on that Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols were who they were looking for, and the same sort of resources were not used to try to find out who else might be involved.
Well, in those first couple of days, especially that first day of the Oklahoma City bombing, there was immediate information that came out about what caused the bombing, witnesses on the scene of the crime, things such as that. And it changed very significantly and drastically as the day went by and the next several days went by. That caused a lot of questions in people's minds about, well, what really happened here? The reason I started doubting the official story that was coming out, you have to understand that the state, the local media were doing a good job the first day. Local law enforcement maybe also, I believe, was doing a good job. But once the feds came in, things started changing.
The police and emergency crews are talking about moving us back because of the danger of a possibility of another explosion.
I think he said another bomb. Another bomb, move back. Oh my God, another bomb.
The fire crews and the various emergency crews are trying to get in, but we keep getting reports that there may be other devices in the area.
They will use that trailer. You see the bucket on the back there, sort of, this is how they would transport the explosive device away from this populated area to try to do something with it.
There were 2 unexploded devices discovered subsequent to the initial explosion.
A second bomb was found on the east side of that building. A bomb squad is on the scene. That second bomb has not exploded. We don't know quite the status yet, if they've managed to defuse it, but it has been confirmed.
There have been reports of 2 explosive devices, unexploded explosive devices.
2 different explosive devices were found in addition to the one that went off.
Just an hour after the initial explosion, downtown Oklahoma City was shaken up again with word of another bomb, or maybe 2.
They've had to back off a couple times because they found, I guess, 2 or 3 other bombs, or at least explosive devices down there that they've had to defuse.
They shut down our operation for about 20-30 minutes because of that, and that was very frustrating because we were right at the point where we had people and we had to leave them.
The first bomb that was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there. The second explosive was found and diffused.
The Oklahoma City bombing was one of the first big stories that I covered, and it was just shocking
to know it was an inside job and to know that the media was involved in the cover-up and that the mainstream television stations there in Oklahoma City knew what had really happened. And then years later, I was able to actually talk to some of those reporters, and they discussed how they were told to shut up. I mean, it just showed how people were so willing to be part of the cover-up just because the truth was so frightening. And that's really why we become so enslaved, is that we just give in to the lies, and they start little, but they get bigger and bigger.
It's amazing when everyone who can see an event and that gets changed into something else simply because the media presents it that way. That means the media is complicit in the cover-up. They're not hapless. They're not ignorant. How come I can figure this out and CNN can't?
The controlled corporate mainstream media is essential to a cover-up like Oklahoma City being successful. And that's why the mainstream media has lost so much credibility. Because all over the nation, people have seen things like Oklahoma City over and over again, where you see the live footage, you see them removing the bombs, you see the governor admitting it. And then later the media says, we never said that. That's what conspiracy theorists say.
At first, the media reported on some of these bothersome pieces of evidence, but they became little more than parrots for the Justice Department as the official story was railroaded into the public mind.
Been listening to Mike McCurry, President Clinton's spokesperson at the White House. Apparently at this point we know a little bit more than the White House does, because we have been able to confirm that it was a car explosion. That word coming to us from Mayor Ron Norick earlier, 1,200 pounds of explosives parked out in front of the federal building. And ATF has confirmed that as well.
Who's going to investigate the investigators? Who's going to investigate the prosecutors? Who's going to hold them accountable? Who's going to hold us public officials accountable? And that's all we're trying to do here, in addition to trying to find the truth.
Well, initially that morning, all the media that was downtown there were reporting the truth. They reported the truth about the unexploded bombs, undetonated bombs being removed from the building. By afternoon, things began to ease a little bit. You could sense a difference, and by the next day, everybody but Channel 4 had changed their story completely.
One local station in Oklahoma City, KFOR-TV, did perform its duty by reporting on McVeigh's accomplices, the evidence of prior warnings, and many other aspects of the case. The New York Times Broadcasting Company purchased KFOR a year after the bombing. The programming director was fired, the lead journalist on the bombing, Jana Davis, was let go, and all reporting that contradicted the government vanished. The victims turned to the government with their questions, expecting the full truth to come out. This was not to be. Those who asked too many questions or knew too much were discouraged from their efforts in other ways.
Debbie Nakanashi, who was with the post office, she was told not to talk to anybody about that. Her job had been threatened to her. She went to the union over it. Then they apologized. But she and I went on a number of occasions to Washington, D.C. We tried to see every senator and every congressman from Oklahoma. Not one would give us an interview.
I was told by an agent, an FBI agent, that due to comments that I'd made, that people like me often ended up dead, and he'd be careful what I said if I was him. And in the way that he put it forth, I felt like it was a threat.
I wrote letters to Janet Reno when she was the United States Attorney General. I wrote Louis Freeh, who was over the FBI at that time. I wrote Senator Orrin Hatch. I wrote everybody I could think of asking for help. Nothing was done.
When the government decided that the investigation was over, a federal grand jury was impaneled to hand down indictments. This is usually a straightforward process. But the federal prosecutors were not counting on one grand juror, Hoppy Heidelberg, to actually ask questions of his own.
My name is Hoppy Heidelberg, and I served on the federal grand jury that was supposed to investigate the Murrah Building bombing in Oklahoma City back in 1995. Actually, the grand jury has two responsibilities that are outlined in this book. The first one says the grand jury operates as a sword, authorizing the government's prosecution of suspected criminals, and also as a shield, protecting citizens from unwarranted or inappropriate prosecutions. Now, that's not something that the media or the government ever points out, but that was actually the reason for a grand jury in the first place, to protect citizens from the crown, who at the time had a habit of prosecuting their political enemies or anybody they chose for any reason. The grand jury, our grand jury, that was supposed to be calling witnesses, were not allowed to call any. And it was my letter to the judge telling him that and demanding that we be allowed to call witnesses that got me excused from the grand jury. What you will hear and what they say that's a lie is that the grand jury foreman is the only one that has the right to do this or that. And that's not true. According to the book, any member can demand anything he wants for any reason. It can be just his personal opinion. It can be from information he gets. And of course, they tell us, well, you can't watch TV, or you can't read the paper. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. Grand jurors need to be well informed if they're going to do their job properly. See, we were never allowed to see the photo evidence from the cameras on the Murrah building that would have shown the truck being parked and the people who got out of the truck. That's all on tape. And we were authorized to see all of that, but we weren't allowed to see it. And in fact, nobody's been allowed to see it. All those tapes have been kept under wraps for 15 years. It was just too important to the American people to know what happened there for me to keep quiet, because nobody else was going to speak up. The other grand jurors were petrified because they observed on a daily basis the kind of intimidation tactics that were used by the Department of Justice attorneys to attempt to keep me under control. And when they found out about the FBI visits to my home, I really shook them up. Now they're even scared to talk to me in the men's room.
Hoppy will never be silenced. In 1998, he ran as an independent candidate for governor of Oklahoma, intent on reopening the investigation into the bombing. After being excluded from the gubernatorial debate, Hoppy walked on stage to ask Governor Frank Keating why.
On both, they're on record as saying that you think I should participate. Do you still believe that?
Thank you, audience. Mr. Jenkins, your follow-up now.
Two years after the bombing, the trial of Tim McVeigh began in Denver, Colorado. The trial had been moved out of Oklahoma despite the constitutional mandate that federal crimes must be tried in the district in which they occurred. The truth seekers were assured that all of their questions would be answered in court.
The trial was not handled appropriately. It was handled in a way that was very prejudiced against the defendants. If you look at what Judge Maitch did concerning prejudicing the jury toward the people that were being prosecuted, by 2 weeks he showed them pictures of dead babies and blood and guts, and which is all basically, in my understanding of the law, illegal to prejudice the jury like that. Yet they did that kind of stuff apparently on purpose.
I was told that by the U.S. attorney that if I attended the trials in Denver, that all of my questions would be answered. I gave up everything I had, my apartment and everything, and I moved to Denver. And I attended both trials, and by the time Terry Nichols' trial was over, I had more questions and no answers.
The trial lasted 3 weeks. In contrast, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995 had lasted 9 months. The jury deliberated for less than 24 hours and sentenced Tim McVeigh to death. McVeigh waived all his appeals and was fast-tracked to be the first federal prisoner executed in decades. Just before his execution date, the FBI announced that they had withheld thousands of pages of documents that could have influenced his trial, which led to a month-long stay of execution.
I mean, they weren't able to get thousands, at least thousands, probably a lot more than that, of documents from, the FBI and the DOJ. They just wouldn't turn them over.
On June 11, 2001, Tim McVeigh was put to death by lethal injection at the federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana. He left no message and was quickly cremated without an autopsy being performed on his body, contrary to the standard procedure for executed prisoners. Terry Nichols was tried and found guilty in a separate trial and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In 2004, Terry Nichols was then tried in Oklahoma on state murder charges in the prosecutor's hope of imposing a death sentence. Nichols was found guilty, but a jury once again refused to execute him.
Those jurors did the best job they could with the case that was presented to them. I think what their statement says is they knew there was something wrong and somebody had some involvement here. But they also, as they have said themselves, that there were lies, there were mistruths, there were bungling, there was arrogance, there was things that were not pursued like the other John Does. And so they felt like there was a reasonable doubt.
Michael Fortier became a witness for the federal prosecutors, received a 10-year sentence, and was released in 2006 directly into the Witness Protection Program. Justice, the government announced, had been served.
And I know tomorrow will be the same, 'cause we got a life of love that will never change.
Hey, my dad's good. Don't listen.
As the government proclaimed justice for all impacted by the bombing, the people back in Oklahoma still sought the truth and knew now they were on their own. The list of questions continued to grow due to the mysterious death of Oklahoma City police officer Sergeant Terrance Yeakey. Terry Yeakey, unlike the rest of Oklahoma, may have known too much. Officer Yeakey was just over 30 years old at the time of the bombing. The morning of the bombing, he was issuing a traffic ticket near the Civic Center Music Hall, which is about 4 blocks to the west of where the Murray Building stood. He dropped the ticket book, let the woman go, and says, I have to obviously attend to other things. He heard the multiple blasts coming from the Murray Building. Sped up there in his black and white squad car and immediately started pulling out the first of 8 people. Mr. Tom Hall being the first, a former employee of the GSA. Tom, to this day, in fact, I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, still has the utmost respect for Officer Yeakey. He literally saved his life. Officer Yeakey, being an astute police officer for 7 years, veteran of the Oklahoma City Police Department, knew that something was horribly wrong. He tried to get the official storyline out through his commanding officers at the Oklahoma City Police Department, through his family, through his ex-wife, and he chose to withhold some of the storyline because he was in fear for his family and his wife and his 2 young daughters at the time. What we found out, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. that morning, he was brutally murdered a mile and a half from the front gate of the El Reno Penitentiary. From that moment that his body was found, we know that the crime scene was destroyed. There were spade shovels that were used to turn over the crime scene. Ballistics, any gunpowder residue, anything that had to do with his death was completely destroyed. It was corrupted.
He started having problems with it, not only at work, but his apartment got broke into, his car got broke into, things were stolen out of his house. He had accumulated reports, evidence, I don't know what all, but he was going to take it out to a mini storage in El Reno. And he left one night, and he told a friend of his that they were going to go out to dinner. He says, I got to run out and put some stuff in mini storage, and as soon as I shake these feds that are following me, I'll be back and we'll go to dinner. Well, he never came back. Instead, he was found the next day by a Canadian County Sheriff's deputy. Well, they found his car first, and then they found him in a field near the El Reno Penitentiary. The damage to his body was obviously a torture homicide. It was obvious. But what intrigued me the most, that he had several cuts on both of his wrists, inside both elbows, both jugular veins. He'd been beaten. He had ligature marks around his neck. He had handcuff marks on his hands, on his wrists, and he had a small caliber bullet wound that started above on the right-hand side of his temple and exited low on his cheek with no powder burns.
The day of his death, when my daughter called me, I left work, went to El Reno to help because I could hear the seriousness in her voice, that she was getting upset. Why would the police be calling her looking for Terrance? And when we went to the apartment where he lived, the manager there stated to us, well, why are you looking for him? The police have already been here and taken his cruiser. So I'm not sure what was going on. It was strange. And about 10 o'clock at night, I had put my grandkids to bed. The phone rang, and when I picked the phone up, I could hear my daughter screaming in the background. And I assumed something bad had happened, but I didn't think death. And my son said, Mom, they found Terry. He's dead.
One of the things that surprised me was that there was no autopsy performed. The other thing that really bothered me was we were being told that Terry was high on drugs and drunk. And, of course, the medical examiner's office did a report on Terry and his injuries, which was really not an autopsy, but just an overview. And it showed that his BAC was 0, meaning no blood alcohol content. There was no drugs in his system. It bothered me that they didn't treat Terry like a police officer like he was. He was a good guy.
And he never said to us that I'm depressed. I need help. Not to me, or not to his sisters. I think it's only fair that we know, as Terrance's family members, what happened.
Officer Yeakey's official cause of death was suicide. And that was actually laid out in the medical examiner's report at the Oklahoma State Medical Office, Examiner's Office. We've since were able to retrieve that record. What we found out, though, is that, number one, the crime scene was corrupted, went completely in the face of a proper investigative procedure. The extent and the amount of and the number of wounds on his body clearly shows that he couldn't commit suicide. Physically and logistically, you just can't do that to yourself. Terry also, we knew, was anemic. He would not have been able to traverse over half a mile from where his car was to where his body was found and not have passed out. His heart would have literally given out. He wouldn't have had enough blood pressure in his body to survive. The car was locked. The windows were rolled out. The keys were in the console. There was a bloody knife in the glove box. You don't stab yourself 13 times and have superficial wounds on along your arms and chest and your upper neck and walk a half a mile and decide to die next to a tree.
Being the family of an officer, I expected some kind of care and consideration for us, being the family of Terrance. There was another detective by the name of Mullinex that told my daughter that she looked at too many movies and she needed to see a psychiatrist. When we were asking questions, wanting to know about his belongings, wanting to know about things that happened during the course of where they say they found my son. And I don't think this was very kind of them and considerate of us being family, that they should have talked to us like that. But they did. And as far as I'm concerned, that made me more suspicious of what happened to my son.
The brutal torture and murder of Terry Yeakey served not only to silence his voice, but the voices of other first responders who may have seen something that would shed light on what really happened. Those who keep their silence know exactly what Terry saw, but he will never be forgotten by those who ask questions and demand answers. In the absence of official action, a group of concerned citizens decided to form their own investigative panel. The OKBIC, better known as the Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee. Their goal was to compile enough evidence that would attract attention by the media and the government, and therefore compel a more thorough investigation. Entirely funded by donations and their own money, the OKBIC took affidavits, recorded eyewitness testimony, and paid for private investigators to chase down leads.
I'm Charles Key, State Representative in Oklahoma City, and I formed the Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee. I had a number of constituents come to me and other people that started raising their own questions about the investigation and what direction it was going, because it seemed like there was an effort to try to change that initial report of what took place on the first day of the bombing as the days and weeks went by.
We look at what State Representative Charles Key did. He went on the facts. He went on the information the grand jury gleaned. And clearly there was complete prior knowledge.
I observed the fact that Charles Key seemed to be standing up for the truth in some areas that I felt like was not being dealt with appropriately by authorities. The Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee was formed for one purpose, and that's to obtain the truth.
First, I thought, that's just another politician trying to get a little publicity. Then when I met them, met Charles Key and Colonel Wallace and Dale Phillips, found out that they were for real, and they asked me if I would join them, and I agreed to join them.
I think Charles Key's work is absolutely outstanding, and it continues to be. Even to this day, we're looking at, 16 years on almost, coming this April. Charles took a lot of risks.
When we saw what was going on with the investigation and that it was trying to move away from the early facts that were presented by law enforcement and by the media, we pursued establishing a county grand jury in Oklahoma County, something unique to Oklahoma and just a few other states in the country, that allows citizens' grand juries to be impaneled to investigate things such as this.
The committee meetings were very serious. We fought the government at every level, all the way through to the Supreme Court of the state.
We had a lot of people that came forward and brought us a lot of information that we wouldn't have gotten any other way. We were pursuing all the information that we could get our hands on about the bombing, and we were trying to get a congressional investigation of the bombing.
I was in awe at the amount of effort that they put in that first 6.5 years before the book was released. And then they had the book released, come out to the general public 3 weeks before 9/11 occurred. And to see every single obstacle that was thrown in their face, from all the way from the news media to financial to emotional, and interviewing over 329 victims, family members, and survivors. And these people were consistently basically saying, I am not going to fail. I'm not going to quit. I want the truth to come out on this.
So we formed the Oklahoma County Grand Jury to have essentially a citizens investigation into the Oklahoma bombing. And that caused us to have to get together a number of signatures from citizens of Oklahoma County, which we did.
We got, 12,000 signatures. We only were required 5,000. And by getting all those signatures, getting them validated and everything, we then got an X amount of money, a lot of money, and the opportunity to set up a grand jury. Well, they turned the grand jury over to our enemy, which was Bob Macy, and basically gave him the money, and then he proceeded to investigate us.
I wrote a letter to the district attorney, Macy, told him what I had seen and that I wanted to testify in the grand jury. I got a letter back from him telling me that the grand jury did not want to hear anything I had to say about the bombing.
After the Oklahoma County grand jury was actually initially formed, then there were some efforts to try to stop that by the Oklahoma County DA and others. And at that time, we organized ourselves in a more formal way. We hired private investigators and some others to help us put the information that we had gathered together in a form that we could present to that county grand jury.
4 or 5, 6 months into the investigation, we started suspecting that our phones were tapped. And I don't remember how we got the information, but we were given a number that we could dial, and it would either confirm that it were tapped or that they weren't. And we'd dial this number, and it would confirm it. We didn't really have anything to hide, so it didn't really make that much difference. It didn't affect our investigation too much.
I think as we finalized our work, as we got to the end, as that grand jury was impaneled, and as we put this report together, we had a lot of media that was waiting for this report. They were ready to give it some significant coverage. And our report came back from the book publisher about 2 weeks before 9/11. And one of the things that we said and some others said during that time frame, as before and after 9/11, that the reason that we did this is because if you don't ask the questions and you don't hold government accountable in everything that it does, not just bombings like this, but everything, then you'll have the same mistakes happen again, and they will get worse as time goes on.
The official story dictated that the Ryder truck packed with 1,200 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil, called ANFO, detonated on the northeast side of the building and was responsible for all the damage. That hypothesis later evolved into 4,800 pounds of ANFO, then up to 7,000 pounds of fertilizer and nitromethane? In fact, the only consistent theme of the official narrative is its inconsistency.
A truck bomb just delivers an air blast. That's all it does. It's called an air blast. And when you've got 8-foot thick columns of concrete filled with rebar the size of your arm, an air blast probably won't even break one. It will break windows. That's about it. But some of these columns were ripped up, shredded, tossed around.
Because a truck bomb is going to release its energy simultaneously in every direction. And so the damage pattern to the building or whatever structure it's parked in front of and intended to blow up, if it's a big structure, bigger than a truck bomb can take out, the damage pattern is going to be roughly a semicircle.
Now, I looked at the building. I was on the bomb squad for a couple of years. I've worked some bombings. And I looked at the building, and I knew that the damage done to that building couldn't have come from a truck with ANFO in it.
A blast does not turn corners. And it did look like that there was a secondary explosion or a more intense explosion towards the east side of the building. Explosion, or that portion of the explosion, did basically clear everything from the front of the building to the south wall.
The Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee was presented with evidence that explosives planted inside the building were responsible for the collapse and most of the casualties. In this rarely seen footage taken by the Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office minutes after the bombing, the north side parking lot is shown littered with paper and debris from inside the Murrah building. How did this volume of paper transport itself against the blast wave of the truck bomb and magically appear on the other side of the street?
And then we look at the fact that you have bombs clearly inside the building. It's blown out across the street, pieces of it on top of buildings, the opposite direction that the rubble should have gone in if there was truly this high-powered truck bomb out front that caused all the damage.
And I can tell you that the building was blown from the inside because all the debris was piled up against the Journal Record building clear across the parking lot.
In fact, several witnesses report that bombs were going off in the building before the truck bomb exploded outside.
The first thing that I experienced when I was sitting there signing some papers for Ruth, I felt the building start shaking, and never had anything like that happen before, and I just kind of froze. And then the lights went out. It didn't get totally dark because the whole front of the building was glass. The lights went out, and then the debris started falling on my desk. And then something hit me in the back of the head and knocked me out before the truck bomb went off. What that tells you is that there were other explosive devices in the building that actually brought the building down.
The building started to sway back and forth. It was going back and forth. And I had sat there and I thought, no, it doesn't feel like an earthquake. And I was, I was kind of stunned. And then about 7 or 8 seconds later, I felt this explosion, and you could actually feel the concrete floor actually rising from underneath you. You could feel it coming up from the inside.
It was like slow motion. We crawled under before the glass started coming, and everything it just seemed to roll in on us. I thought it was an earthquake when it started. It was just a kind of a shake, and then everything started going like this, and I dove under the desk, and then all the glass came in and the ceilings came down. And
3 seismographs at the University of Oklahoma, the Omniplex Science Museum, and in Franklin, Oklahoma, recorded a seismic event lasting 8 to 10 seconds that suggests the possibility of 2 blasts. There were 2 energetic spikes. One was the truck bomb, and the second spike was explained away as air blast pushing on the ground or falling debris. But a representative of the Oklahoma Geological Survey stated for the record that this spike was not the result of floors collapsing, and that the last 5 seconds of ground motion did not have air blast associated with it. The Khobar Towers bombing in 1996 in Saudi Arabia killed 19 U.S. airmen. That bomb was several times larger than the bomb supposed to have been used in Oklahoma. It left a huge 85-foot crater, yet there was no major structural damage on the simple slab building. What happened in Oklahoma City to cause the major horizontal support beam to fail and the complete failure of these 2 series of columns on the east side of the building? This collapse was responsible for most of the casualties. The crater, when seen from above, is offset from the major structural damage in the building. For some reason, the official story has inflated the size of this crater.
The bomb, at least I've seen where the reports from the different agencies have said the bomb extended from the cab to the tail of the truck. And one of the things that really bothers me about that is the rear axle from the truck went down and collided with the car in front of the Regency Tower about 1.5 blocks away. The front axle of the truck was hurled eastbound and struck a parking meter about 1.5 blocks away in front of the YMCA building. If the bomb was that big, that rear axle would have been driven into the crater, and instead of being split apart as they were. And the truck bomb itself, to me, had to be between the 2 axles. It could not have been over that rear axle.
I was surprised from even the FEMA report and the published reports that nobody could determine what the size of the crater was. And that's one of the things I brought up at the grand jury investigation, is that the crater was half the size that they had proposed in the FEMA report. The crater had a 5-gallon bucket sitting next to it after they had it uncovered, and you could extrapolate from the size of that bucket to the size of the hole as to what size of the crater was. And it was approximately 16 feet across.
August 24, 1970. It was a Monday morning. Carlton Armstrong, his brother Dwight, and 2 other perpetrators, Leo Burt and one other individual, drove up to the side of the Sterling Hall. It was a math research building. Dow Chemical had their offices there. It was federal government as well as the university faculty that worked there. And they had drove a Ford Econoline van stolen from a math professor, laden with 4 metal drums, 50-gallon drums full of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The Sterling Hall bombing consisted of 2,000 pounds of ANFO, and it was set off right next to the building. The windows were blown in, the facade was damaged, but there was no structural damage. In fact, the Army Math Lab was closed for only 1 day. In Oklahoma City, a similar ANFO bomb detonated 15 feet away from a much more robust structure and inflicted massive structural damage. What that case did was it was a bellwether. It set a standard for us to look at. It says, okay, if ANFO was in fact used in Oklahoma City, why did it not have the characteristics of what occurred in Madison? Furthermore, the signature of an ANFO explosion is nitric oxide, a noxious gas.
There was certainly no fertilizer bomb. We know that because there was no ammonia gas in the air. In every other explosion, and some students blew up did make an ammonium nitrate bomb, but everybody who rushed to that building after the explosion had to be hospitalized. If you ever smelled ammonia strongly, And you're talking about going into a horse trade or something like that. That's not strong, but that'll gag you. It will sear your lungs. I mean, everybody that smelled that ammonia gas after the ammonium nitrate bomb at that university had to be hospitalized. It would have been 30 minutes or an hour, depending on how hard the wind was blowing, before anybody could have even approached the Murrah building if there had been an ammonium nitrate bomb.
There were other search and rescue personnel that were down there immediately from St. Anthony's Hospital and nearby, as well as office employees from the surrounding offices. They would have approached the crime scene and buckled over almost immediately, vomiting violently, if there was ammonium nitrate gas. There wasn't.
I was watching General Parton, the former head of Air Force Weapons Development, point out that the building was blown out, that it wasn't the signature of an ammonium nitrate fertilizer bomb, that there'd been a cover-up.
The damaged Murrah building drew the attention of retired General Benton K. Parton, former director of the Air Force Armaments Laboratory. General Parton spent his career conducting bomb damage analysis with explosives for the military. General Parton came to Oklahoma City, examined the available evidence, and rendered a conclusion far different than the story being pandered by the government and media.
I spent over 30 years in the Air Force. Most of that was in research and development. I went to a 2-year graduate program, 8 quarters of armament engineering graduates, the first course that was ever set up. And after that, I worked at the Ballistic Research Laboratories at Aberdeen, which was 2 years of hands-on work designing, developing continuous rod warhead for the Beaumont missile and other weapon systems. Well, the truck bomb, even though it was fairly massive, was somewhat removed from some of the structures that were damaged. They clearly had some what you call Broussard's damage, where the blast pressure was way above what you would expect to get from the truck at that distance.
Broussard's damage is that caused by an explosive whose blast wave is powerful enough to shatter and destroy the material affected. The problem with the failed columns at the Murrah building is at that distance, the air blast from an ANFO bomb would have been 10 times less powerful than what was needed to dissolve the concrete and cut the rebar. Those columns, had they failed due to air blast, should have broken with sharp chunks of concrete connected by rebar, not sheared off at critical points. Broussard's damage indicates contact explosives placed directly on the beams. Even more perplexing is the total collapse of column B3, which caused the floors on the east side to pancake onto one another. The building was gutted to within feet of the other side. Column B4, closer to the truck bomb, is completely intact. Yet we are supposed to believe that a blast wave traveled through B4, leaving the sheetrock almost untouched, and completely destroyed the column farther away. And most of the front columns were destroyed when the supporting header beam failed. But the cause of failure, supposedly being air blast, should have thrown it into the building. Instead, it fell straight down and rolled towards the crater. General Parton's report was conclusive. The Murrah Federal Building was not destroyed by one sole truck bomb. The major factor in its destruction appears to have been detonation of explosives carefully placed at 4 critical junctures on supporting columns within the building. Many independent experts concurred with the Parton report. Sam Cohen, inventor of the neutron bomb, issued this statement. I believe that the demolition charges in the building that were placed inside at certain key concrete columns did the primary damage to the Murrah Federal Building. It would have been absolutely impossible and against the laws of nature for a truck full of fertilizer and oil, no matter how much was used, to bring the building down. The FBI put all their weight behind the lone bomber theory and tailored the evidence to fit that scenario. Dr. Frederick Whitehurst, a supervisor at the FBI crime lab, turned whistleblower over the Bureau's handling of the evidence in the Oklahoma City bombing.
Released a report today condemning the FBI crime lab for mishandling evidence and for slanting its analysis. The report is expected to specifically criticize the lab's handling of the Oklahoma City and World Trade Center bombing cases. It was the allegations of FBI whistleblower Frederick Whitehurst that sparked that investigation.
Forced to resign, Dr. Whitehurst testified in Terry Nichols' trial that a fellow FBI chemist had changed his findings and lied under oath after meeting with federal prosecutors. The Office of the Inspector General, or OIG, investigated Whitehurst's charges and issued a report which concluded that the FBI crime lab had improperly identified the characteristics of ANFO, the weight of the bomb, the detonation system, and even what kind of explosive was used.
Oklahoma City case will get a lot of attention because what the Inspector General goes on to at some length to say in his analysis of agent testimony in some of the pre-trial stages is that one agent in particular made sort of seat-of-the-pants estimates about the Oklahoma City bomb, but then couched them in his reports, in his written reports, as being the result of scientific evidence.
The FBI laboratory has billed itself for many, many years as the premier forensic laboratory in the world. The people that did the things they did knew doggone well what they were doing.
The Wright Armament Laboratory at Eglin Air Force Base conducted a series of explosive tests to compare their data to the bombing in Oklahoma. The Eglin test structure was a simple 3-story concrete slab building with no support columns. The engineers at Eglin tried to recreate the truck bomb as McVeigh and the FBI claimed it was constructed, with 4,000 pounds of ANFO packed into a dozen barrels. But they found that each barrel acted as a separate bomb, canceling out the explosive force of each other and pushing most of the blast upwards. So they constructed a single more powerful bomb and exploded it outside the target building to test the effects of air blast. They found that their weaker test structure suffered less damage from a more powerful bomb than was supposedly used at Oklahoma City. The report for the Wright Laboratory at Eglin Air Force Base concluded the damage at the Murrah Federal Building is not the result of the truck bomb itself, but rather due to other factors such as locally placed charges within the building. The evidence is undeniable, despite the pleas of the official story, that the Ryder truck bomb was not the sole cause of destruction that day, that there were bombs placed inside the building, which caused the brunt of casualties as floors collapsed on helpless victims.
And the rescuers apparently had to abandon the people they were trying to rescue temporarily.
Were you there a minute ago when somebody yelled they thought they'd seen a second device?
Yes, sir. We were close to the parking area trying to recover a victim.
As rescuers desperately tried to free the victims from the rubble, several evacuations of the site, due to reports of other bombs, impeded these efforts.
At some point, we got to the corner of 5th, and I believe it was Robinson, right there at the corner of the Murrah building, and we heard second bomb. Somebody yelled second bomb. I stopped. I turned around. People were running past me, and I just kind of watched what was unfolding. Of course, nothing ever did happen.
The Oklahoma Highway Patrol reported that another explosive device was found. The Oklahoma City Fire Department confirmed that. Defense Department logs recorded that a second bomb was disarmed, a third bomb was evacuated.
The explosive that they disarmed last night was even larger.
Who planted these bombs and had access to the Murrah building before the bombing? A deputy sheriff recorded this footage during one of the evacuations. Here the ATF is seen pulling out several weapons and blocks of what appeared to be plastic explosive. Was this the source of the bomb scare, or did this ordnance come from an illegal armory that witnesses report the ATF kept in the Murrah building? The ATF denies they kept any weapons or explosives in the building.
Day 1, hour 2 of the bombing, the most significant event that happened is when they said they found other bombs in the building. The second most significant event was that they moved everybody back and held them back. There were still people alive trapped in the building, but they came in with 2 trucks and backed them up to the Murrah building, and a bunch of these guys dressed in blue jackets with no letters on the back started taking boxes of files out and putting them on this truck.
We were told by a blonde female agent that there were files so serious to the government that until those files were located, there would not be any recovery effort.
If you remember the Whitewater investigation in Arkansas, all the paperwork was stored in the Murrah building. They had FBI agents over in the fields to the west of the Murrah building picking up paper almost all day long.
And it was during this time that early in the investigation that I started receiving some various phone calls. One of them was a phone call from Little Rock, Arkansas. The guy said that he was a federal agent. He was not an FBI agent. He was not ATF. But what he did say was during their investigation of the Clintons, on all the drug running that went through Mena, Arkansas, and Lassiter's Ranch and all of that stuff that was going on at the time during Iran-Contra, that those records, when Clinton went to Washington, were transferred from there to the Murrah building.
Because of the additional bomb threats or because the building was unstable and the firefighters couldn't get to them,
So those are a lot of patients I think were lost that could have been saved.
After rescue and recovery had been halted, the building was prepped for demolition even though all the bodies had not been recovered, and despite the architect's report that it could be rebuilt. The investigative team from the American Society of Civil Engineers was not allowed on site. The defense lawyers from McVeigh were able to visit the site one time, but even then, they were not allowed to view the crater.
They were going to halt it on the 29th of April. They were going to halt the recovery and prepare the building to be imploded. We went back in after the final demolition to relocate 2 victims that we knew that we had left, and the possibility of a 3rd victim, which we also located him. I don't know why they were in such a rush. GSA was saying the building was unsafe and needed to be brought down.
A month after the bombing, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was completely demolished with less than 200 pounds of explosives. The wreckage was buried under armed guard, and one can only think that certain officials breathed a sigh of relief as the outstanding counterpoint to the official story disappeared in a cloud of dust. Tidbits of truth about the Oklahoma City bombing would often come from the most unlikely of places. Another strange and brutal murder, at first seemingly unrelated to the bombing, would set the stage for some of the most damning evidence that the government was withholding from the public.
My name is Jesse Trinidou. I'm an attorney from Salt Lake City, Utah. My brother, Kenneth Michael Trinidou, was murdered in the Federal Transfer Center here in Oklahoma City in August of 1995. Kenny had a hard life. You know, I've often thought about that and how he ended up the way he did. He was an incredibly bright man, an incredible athlete. He set the national record in high school for the 2-mile run as a freshman. Went into the service, and like so many boys did during the Vietnam War, they come out heroin addicts. He robbed banks, or 2 banks, to support that habit. He was caught and he pled guilty. He went and did his time. He was a very strong guy. He wasn't very big, but he was very tough. He was easygoing, but he wouldn't back down. So if you pushed him, you were going to get a fight, and it was a fight you were going to lose. We loved him and stood behind him, and he was a good man. Kenny was supposedly arrested for a probation violation and sent to Oklahoma City at the transfer center for a probation hearing. We now know that that's crap. I said to him, Kenny, what are you doing there? And he said, well, they sent me back here for a probation hearing. And we talked about getting him a lawyer and the fact that we didn't expect him to do more than a couple of months. And so my mother called me at work. It was about 7 in the morning and told me that, and I couldn't believe it. And that Kenny supposedly killed himself, because I had just spoken with him the night before. There's no way in hell he would have killed himself. This was not a guy who kills himself. I mean, his life is the best it's ever been. I found out later that an autopsy had already been done. Now, the federal government didn't want one done, but the state of Oklahoma required one for a death and incarceration. So the federal government didn't know that there was an autopsy done and did not want the autopsy done. And the federal government went twice to the medical examiner's office asking to have Kenny cremated. It took a week to get his body released and home. And I kept getting the runaround from the federal government, and finally I just screamed into the phone one day, why don't you keep him? And when the body comes home, it's totally made up, so you can't see the wounds. He was beaten head to toe. His skull was smashed in 3 places. The soles of his feet had been beaten. You could see the fingerprint bruises on his arm where he'd been held. His throat was cut, and he'd been strangled. And the federal government said it was a suicide by hanging. When his body's turned over to the medical examiner, 2 hours later, he's wearing nothing but boxer shorts. The government said they don't know what happened to the clothes. They cleaned the cell that morning so the medical examiner can't do an examination of it. And the medical examiner is not allowed into the cell for 6 months. And when he finally is allowed in, he does a test that's called luminol that will reveal the presence of blood. And Fred Jordan told me that the cell lit up like a Christmas tree. The logbooks involving my brother disappeared. The ones that didn't disappear, the pages from the logbooks are missing. The crime scene photographs disappear. The negatives of the crime scene photographs disappear. The video camera supposedly malfunctions. Within an hour of death, he'd consumed the equivalent of 30 bottles of Coca-Cola. And Dr. Jordan told me that caffeine is used in a lot of countries, like third world countries, to enhance pain under torture. And he also told me that the beatings on the soles of the feet were indicative of torture. And I believe it was the FBI. I firmly believe that for a lot of reasons. Now, I didn't start out believing that. I started out trusting them until I could see what they were doing. And they would come to me asking for information and then immediately go and destroy the evidence, threaten the witness, do everything they could to prevent the case from being made of murder. Information was coming into me. People were leaking me stuff. They wanted me to know. They didn't want me to know who they were. Late December of 95, early January of 96, I get a phone call. The person won't leave their name. The person said your brother was killed by the FBI. They said it was an interrogation that went bad. It was a case of mistaken identity, that he fit a profile of people who were robbing banks to get money to attack the federal government. Just before he was executed, I get a message from Tim McVeigh. And he told me, he said, when I saw your brother's picture and heard what happened to him, I wanted you to know that I think the FBI killed him because they thought he was Richard Lee Guthrie.
Early on, the FBI had investigated the possibility that a string of bank robberies committed by what the media dubbed the Midwest Bank Robbers had financed the bombing. Led by Peter Langan and Richard Lee Guthrie, a.k.a. Wild Bill, the gang called themselves the Aryan Republican Army. The purpose of the robberies? To finance a race war within the United States. Wild Bill closely resembled some of the John Doe No. 2 sketches and had a tattoo similar to that reported by witnesses. In an affidavit, Peter Langan revealed that a member of the ARA had admitted to liabilities concerning the bombing. Another member had threatened, "We're going to get them. We're going to hit one of their buildings during the middle of the day. It's going to be a federal building." Most of the ARA was arrested for bank robbery soon after the bombing. Peter Langan offered to provide information about his co-conspirator's relationship with McVeigh. This offer was refused.
Then I got a call from a great guy, J.D. Cash. He was a hunting and fishing reporter at the McCurtain County News in eastern Oklahoma. He'd had friends that were killed in the bombing and family, wounded. And one day he calls me up and he says, "Jesse, can I talk to you?" I said, "Well, sure, who are you?" He says, "I'm J.D. Cash." And he says, "I'm investigating the bombing in Oklahoma." And he said, "I'm interested in your brother's death. Can I ask you some questions?" And I said, "Yes." And J.D. said, "Well, do you have any tattoos?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "What and where?" I said, "A dragon tattoo on his left forearm." J.D. said, "Oh, my God." He said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Let me tell you this." He said, "When your brother was picked up and sent to Oklahoma, the largest manhunt in American history was in place for John Doe 2. We didn't start out to solve the Oklahoma City bombing case. We started out for justice for my brother. But every lead, every trail, every bit of important evidence has brought us to the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, the Freedom of Information Act is an act Congress passes that says the government's supposed to turn over documents and information to you that you request, unless there's a good reason not to, such as national security. I bring the first FOIA suit saying I want all documents showing the link between the FBI and the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Oklahoma City bombing. And the FBI comes back and says there are no documents. They didn't know that I'd been leaked 2 teletypes from FBI Director Louis Freeh, then Director Louis Freeh, talking about Elohim City, talking about informants, talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center, talking about the fact that McVeigh had called Elohim City 2 days before the bombing asking for more help. So I sued them, and they walk into court and they tell the federal judge there's no documents. Well, I file those too. The federal judge looks at them and he says, you go back, you do a manual search, and you bring everything you find back in the court. Well, then they come back and plead with the judge, and they say, Judge, we promised anonymity, and if we have to disclose these documents, it will reveal their names and their lives will be in jeopardy.
German citizen Andreas Karl Strassmeyer, a.k.a. Andy the German, came to the U.S. in the early 90s. Professing neo-Nazi beliefs, he moved to Elohim City, becoming their chief of security. He was reported by ATF informant Carol Howe and others to make threats about bombing federal buildings and assassinations of public officials. It is known that McVeigh called Elohim City twice, looking for the mysterious German, when members of the ARA were living with Strassmeyer. McVeigh also attempted to reach Andy's attorney Kirk Lyons by phone in the days before the bombing.
We started looking at Strassmeyer real hard, and this guy didn't add up either. He was on special assignment and disappears and shows up in Elohim City. He came in through Texas and was placed at Elohim City. Now, why Elohim City? I mean, nobody in Germany, if I haven't heard of Elohim City and I live in Oklahoma, how's anybody in Germany hear of this place? Well, evidently, it was from a lawyer named Kirk Lyons. I started putting dots together, and I started finding out who these people are and who they know and who they run with and what their background and what their history is, and we create a picture from this. We have Strassmeyer doing all this paramilitary training, takes over as chief of security of a place that didn't need any security, tells them they need to get rid of their shotguns and deer rifles and buy assault rifles and SKSs and AKs and stuff like this because they're going to be the next Waco. Well, he scares them down there. They don't know what to do, so they start, gearing up for the last days of the book of Revelation.
Strassmeyer is an interesting character, these documents we got from the court. It's my understanding he's a German intelligence officer. He is apparently, after the bombing, taken out of the country by a former CIA operative back to Germany. His visa, as I understand, had expired, and no one picked him up, and he was smuggled out through Mexico and back to Germany.
I said, why wasn't Andy Strassmeyer questioned? And one of the attorneys said, oh, we did question him. I said, yeah, but you waited until he got back to Germany, and then you called him up over the phone and asked him, did he have anything to do with the bombing?
At Tulsa, at Lady Godiva's, which is a strip bar, one of the strippers named Shanti said that McVeigh and Strassmeyer and several people had come in a few days before the bombing, and there was a Ryder truck parked out in the parking lot.
What we can say about Timothy McVeigh's connections to Elohim City is that he called there at least twice, once on April 5th and once on April 17th, that he checked into a motel within miles from there, that he received a speeding ticket within miles from there, and that he also calls outlying areas of Elohim City residents or acquaintances. So very briefly, those are his provable connections to Elohim City.
The Southern Poverty Law Center, along with the FBI, kept informants in Elohim City. One of these may have been Strassmeyer, the supposed neo-Nazi. Known primarily for its work in litigating against hate groups and its outspoken chief counsel Morris Dees, the SPLC has also become an informal intelligence gathering arm of the FBI and now the Department of Homeland Security. They share the same interest with the federal government in suppressing what they knew about prior knowledge.
By the FBI's own admission, there were at least between 4 and 6 informants at Elohim City. I don't know what the population of Elohim City is, but it sounds like whenever 3 people get together to talk about overthrowing the government, 2 of them are working for the government.
Andy Strassmeyer's roommate at Elohim City was Michael Brescia, a young skinhead from Philadelphia who was also a member of the ARA. He was later convicted for bank robbery and also bore a striking resemblance to the John Doe No. 2 sketches. The FBI and the ATF had something to hide in eastern Oklahoma. Was McVeigh in Elohim City? If so, what was he doing?
My name's Josiah Stone, and I was on a spiritual journey. I integrated quite quickly into Elohim City, and I was able to identify with their concept of life because I was looking for some answers to my own life. I saw Timothy McVeigh at Elohim City 8 weeks prior to the Oklahoma City bombing. And I remember him distinctly because he has a distinct face. But he was smiling. He was smiling. He was happy as he could be. These people were loaded for bear, and they were ready. And they meant business. I believe the mindset at Elohim City was they didn't give a damn whether they were implicated in it or not.
What was interesting, and I think no one has paid any attention to it, is that the CIA was involved at Elohim City. Not only were they involved, but they had the spy satellites. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I'd never heard of them before. They run the spy satellites. They had them over Elohim City. I think one of the things that may be most productive to getting at the truth was the discovery of an operation the FBI had in place since about 1991 called PATCON. P-A-T-C-O-N. It's short for Patriot Conspiracy. It was an idea they had to infiltrate every militia group, every neo-Nazi group, every group critical of the government in the United States. The plan apparently was to put informants in with all of these groups. And I think Elohim City was a PATCON operation. I think McVeigh was obviously involved in it. Now, whether he was a target or an operative, I don't know, any more than I know whether the government intended to blow up the Murrah building. But they knew it was going to happen, and they knew McVeigh was going to do it, and they don't stop him.
As alleged in David Hoffman's book, The Oklahoma City Bombing and the Politics of Terror, Strassmeyer first aroused suspicion that he was an undercover operative when he was caught in Texas entering a federal building at night with a key code. Did he have access to the Murrah building also?
When we interviewed Jane Graham, who was a survivor, she said that when she went to work, it was either the day before or 2 days before, I don't remember which, she parked in the basement parking, and when she got out of her car and was walking across the parking garage, she saw 3 guys down there wearing coveralls and placing putty on the columns and stringing wire between the putty. Later, she picks out one of the guys from photographs and says, that's him, and it was Andreas Strassmeyer.
Strassmeyer was there listening, going over the plans. He was listening to everything. He was, what they were talking about, looking at place, pointing to things. But when they were talking, whatever they happened to finally be talking about, and when I was looking at him, at that point, then he left and went over to the other side of the building so I wouldn't keep watching him. The second man that was there, who appeared to be military, he's the one that the man in charge told to put the stuff back in the car. The second man obviously was taking orders from the first man because he had wire in his hands, which I thought was telephone wire. It's that real light color, thin wire. And he also had what appeared to be gray putty.
Well, that's exactly how you string composition C4 with det cord.
And the details are chilling. We'll also focus on surveillance cameras that caught the bombing on tape and maybe the men behind the bombing. The News Channel has new information tonight that there's a chance surveillance tapes could be the smoking gun evidence. Now, we asked candid questions in a rare face-to-face meeting with ATF officials close to the investigation. We learned that video collected from downtown businesses the morning of April 19th may someday be played before a jury. Officials won't say who or what exactly is on the tape. However, numerous sources have confirmed the tapes exist and that they reveal more than one bomber.
And I said, I want 2 other things from the FBI. I want the tapes from the surveillance cameras leading up to the Murrah buildings on the day of the bombing, on the different buildings around the Murrah building. And I want the tapes from the cameras on the Murrah building, because I had received a government document that said surveillance cameras show the bomb detonating 3 minutes and 6 seconds after the suspects exited the truck. Suspects, not one, plural. The fight now is over those tapes. They don't deny they exist. They just say we can't find them. Now, the notion that this is the biggest crime the Bureau had ever investigated at that point in time, the largest mass murder in American history, the two most important pieces of evidence you have, the arrest of McVeigh and the videotape showing McVeigh delivering the bomb to the Murrah building, you can't find? Incredible.
The enhanced photo shows a very distinct possibility of a man standing behind that truck. And the time sequence camera took additional photographs. So will those additional photographs show there was a man there? Will they show that he was alone? Will it show it was the suspect, Tim McVeigh? The additional photographs in the trial should help point that out.
I think one of the things that stands out to me is the fact that during that first morning, while we were being held at bay from doing any recovery work, there were FBI agents, or at least men in FBI raid jackets, dismantling the video cameras off the side of the building.
I'm Charlie Rose. I'm with Legend Video Transfer, and the FBI had employed me to duplicate a number of videos for them shortly after the Murrah bombing. I was asked to duplicate approximately 400 tapes for the FBI. We had 2 FBI agents in the office. We had 2 studios set up for duplication, and each FBI agent was required to stay in the room with each of us that were in that room. Really didn't have the opportunity to sit back and watch the videos. There's probably a lot to learn, from the videos that they saw. Some of them are meaningless, but others, could make some powerful impact on what actually happened.
The government will not release the film that was in the video cameras on the front of the building that would show whether I was accurate or not accurate.
Of course, the other Achilles heel is the videotapes of the building itself from the different surveillance cameras that no one's seen. If McVeigh was Lee Harvey McVeigh all by himself, the lone nut with the truck, then why don't they show us the videotapes of the truck? Show us the videotapes of him getting out. Or was there more than him in the truck?
There were like 22 films in the area that were confiscated by the FBI that would have shown the truck being pulled up, people getting out of the truck. It would have shown what was going on at the time the explosions took place. And obviously they confiscated those, and it didn't take much to figure out that the federal authorities weren't trying to get to the truth. They seemed to be covering up things.
Their first objective is to protect the agency, not to do what's right, not to do justice, not to serve the American people. It's to protect themselves. And they will do anything to do that.
Tim McVeigh was honorably discharged from the Army 3 years before the bombing, leaving behind an exemplary service record. After a brief but intense combat experience in the Persian Gulf War, McVeigh tried out for the Special Forces. He pronounced himself unable to continue just a few days into the testing and returned to his unit demoralized and, some say, a changed man.
Through being able to see Timothy McVeigh's letters to his defense team, this is really behind-the-scenes stuff, letters to his family, the memos the defense team writes, which detail his mood from day to day, some of the medical reports while he's in prison, which detail his thoughts. On the one hand, you have the McVeigh who's mad at the government. On the other hand, you have the McVeigh who works for the government. The defense team themselves could never obtain his full military records, and that even though they were ordered by a judge.
Where does he turn up? He turns up in Buffalo, New York. And while he's up there, he creates what's known as a legend. Now, legend is when you go undercover or you get sheep-dipped. Sheep-dipped means you change your identity, you change who you work for, and become a new person. He changes his personality up there, and all of a sudden he's ranting and raving about the Turner Diaries and overthrowing the government and all this other nonsense to where they're going. This guy's a wacko. He works up there 6 months and disappears. Where do we find him again? Going into militia meetings and doing the same thing, making sure he's noticed.
If you look at Lee Harvey Oswald and Tim McVeigh and other patsies, they're very similar. They're in the military, they've got security clearances,
McVeigh wrote a letter to his sister, who turned it over to the FBI, in which he admits that he was selected out of Special Forces training to participate in covert operations, to help run drugs to fund these operations, and to assassinate security risks. Mere bravado, or was McVeigh telling the truth?
The FBI had put wiretaps on the McVeigh family's phone after the bombing. And so I'm reading this conversation back and forth between his mother and his sister. There's actually a few of these conversations where they say, "We don't understand why the FBI won't listen to us and why the media is reporting that Timothy McVeigh washed out or dropped out of Special Forces." They're saying, no, we were told that he was still active in the military and that he was working on these covert missions.
And he told his family, he told many others, Terry Nichols has signed an affidavit, that McVeigh believed he was out there infiltrating militias and right-wing groups and was preparing to set them up. And then, of course, he later learned that he was the guy that got set up.
If McVeigh was working for the government, what are we to make of the involvement of Terry Nichols, the only convicted accomplice?
When Nichols had been convicted, but not given the death penalty, in federal court and in state court, he could not be tried again. He wrote to then Attorney General Ashcroft, and said, "Come and see me. Come and see me, and I'll tell you all about it."
In his declaration, Nichols stated that crucial parts of this terrorist attack remain hidden from the American people, especially the identities of others unknown who collaborated with McVeigh in the bombing. McVeigh told Nichols that he had been recruited to perform undercover missions while in the U.S. Army. Always the good soldier, McVeigh revealed only one name in his chain of command, Larry Potts, Assistant Director of the FBI and the lead agent on the Ruby Ridge catastrophe in 1992, in which a U.S. Marshal and 14-year-old Sam Weaver and his mother Vicki Weaver were killed. Larry Potts later played an active role in the siege at Waco. McVeigh was angry at Potts for going off script and changing targets at the last minute. Another telling clue is on Tim McVeigh's death certificate. Despite being officially out of the military for 9 years and having held many different jobs since then, his listed occupation was U.S. Army. So why did Tim McVeigh take the fall for his accomplices? Perhaps the intervention of a known psychological warfare expert explains his silence till the end.
The record clearly shows that Dr. Jolyon West consulted Timothy McVeigh's defense team. Dr. West had previously been a psychiatrist and consulted for Patty Hearst, Saran, and Jack Ruby.
We know that Jolyon West was considered to be the #2 mind control expert in North America under only Dr. Ewing Cameron.
Dr. West came under a lot of scrutiny during his time as chief of psychiatry at UCLA because he was proposing using prisoners, the general community, poor people, minorities as test subjects. And then West's career continues to flourish through the 80s, and he continues his research into hypnosis, branches out into terrorism and cults, even consulting and later writing about the Waco massacre.
Dr. John Smith, that's even his real name, was the protege of Dr. Jolyon West, Mr. Mind Control, and he was McVeigh's doctor in prison. Today it's reported that he is one of the head psychiatrists, one of the head doctors at Guantanamo Bay. The fact that you've got the protege of one of the fathers of modern mind control now being the head of psychiatry at Guantanamo Bay, which is an admitted mind control laboratory, that's even mainstream news. I mean, you couldn't make this up in a spy novel. Truth is always stranger than fiction, and it's all hidden in plain view.
Was the bombing the product of a sting gone out of control, with McVeigh taking the blame for a series of government failures?
They kind of set up a sting operation, it appears to me, that went bad. They thought they would stop, the efforts of Strassmeyer, Millar, and others through Elohim City.
I eventually talked to this Senate staffer, and he informed me that the Oklahoma City bombing was actually a sting operation that went wrong, and that the effort to cover it up was because they were not able to stop this sting operation.
When it fell apart in that they weren't able to stop it right before it took place, and proclaim to the public how great they were so they could get new funding for the ATF, because the ATF had lost so much credibility due to the Randy Weaver situation. I don't know if anybody will ever know. I know my brother was killed. I'm often asked why. I know my brother was killed for information he didn't have about the bombing. Why the people in the Murrah building were killed. As I said, I don't know if they intended it or it just got away from them. God, I hate to think that they did it on purpose.
Perhaps it was a deliberate attack by a criminal element in this government, using the reins of power to execute and cover up their crime.
In 2006, the American behavioral scientist published the whole journal on this concept that's being developed called a state crime against democracy, SCAD for short. There's a recognition, a growing recognition among academia that oftentimes people have not pursued culpability into elite crimes for the fear of being called a conspiracy theorist. When there is a state crime against the people, what generally happens is that inquiries into these crimes tend to be highly controlled, tightly framed, and totally reliant on agencies who stand to be embarrassed by investigations.
It's now been declassified that the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 to get the United States fully committed into the Vietnam War was a staged event, and those LBJ tapes have been released, where days before McNamara is telling him on the phone how they're going to stage the event to get the United States into the war and what he would need to say at those press conferences. In early 1995, the entire United States was politically awakening. The population was angry about Waco. They were angry about the United States losing its sovereignty and Bill Clinton trying to pass anti-Second Amendment legislation. The federal government was forced to basically come in and create a crisis so they could demonize anyone who thought the government was too big or out of control. In 1994 and 1995, the Congress had tried unsuccessfully to pass their omnibus crime bill that expanded federal jurisdiction, that went after the Second Amendment, that was going to create all these new federal agencies to spy on the American people. And that was one of the reasons that Oklahoma and other states were upset. They understood this was totally unconstitutional and a huge federal overreach, and it violated the 10th Amendment. But after the Oklahoma City bombing tragedy, suddenly they were able to rename it as the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, and that was able to sell through.
Well, I think one of the things we'll be seeing over the next few weeks and months are new legislation, both to deal with domestic groups and international terrorism. There's already one bill, the Omnibus Terrorism Act of 1995, that's on the cards. One of the dangers is that we stepped a little bit too far, and this bill is very controversial.
We see amazing parallels between Oklahoma City and 9/11. And we see it also being used as a mass conditioning tool to launch a new war. In the case of Oklahoma City, a war against the American people. In the case of 9/11, a war against the Middle East and an invasion for resources.
President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, recently said that you can never let a good crisis go to waste. This is an example of real politic. Taken to its extreme, we can quote the words of Robert Shapiro, former Clinton advisor, who recently wrote in an editorial that the only thing that can save the Obama administration is another terror attack like Oklahoma City or 9/11. So they think of us as expendable. They're willing to ride our ashes, stand in our graves to preserve their position. This is an example of the noble lie.
And in the months and weeks building up to the Oklahoma City bombing, there was incredible conditioning on the news. These people are scared of the federal government. They're terrorists. They're going to kill you. They're going to bomb you. You watch, it's going to happen. And then sure enough, it happened. And then you look at the evidence, and government and black op fingerprints are all over it. The establishment is going to have trouble in the future orchestrating further atrocities like Oklahoma City, because the public is now really getting wise to their tricks. Oklahoma City is one of the best examples we've got where we can prove clearly that the official story is a fraud, that the government was involved and is using it to demonize good Americans.
April 19, 1995. will live on in history as a reminder that we must all take an active role in holding our leaders accountable. Its legacy and lessons must be rooted in truth, not myth. The victims demand truth and justice. We have all witnessed firsthand the harsh reality of a government's ability to manifest its will upon the people. And it's up to the people to deprive government of the power to commit crimes and profit from the lies.
It is every patriotic American's duty, every man, woman, and child's responsibility to research the facts contained in this film, to verify for yourself that this information is true and that the rabbit hole goes even deeper, and then take action to bring the criminals that perpetrated this attack to justice.
By all outward appearances, Terrance Yeaky had everything to live for in the spring of 1996. A respected 7-year veteran of the Oklahoma City Police Department, Terrance Yeaky had earned awards, accolades, and honors for his work in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, where he worked tirelessly in the rubble and the debris for over 3.5 hours, dragging 8 people from the building that day, saving their lives. In November of 1995, he had been promoted to the position of sergeant in the Oklahoma City Police Department. He had received the key to the city of El Reno, Oklahoma, for his heroism in the aftermath of and he was getting ready to move to Dallas, Texas, to begin work for the FBI. And yet, he was under intense persecution from the Oklahoma City Police Department itself for his refusal to confirm the official story of the Oklahoma City bombing. You see, Terrance Yeakey saw something in those moments after the bombing, something that disturbed him enough to cause him to stand up against the Oklahoma City Police Department that he had spent 7 years serving. He knew, and he repeatedly attempted to tell his superiors, that the bombing did not happen the way that the public was told that it happened. He was in the process of collecting records and documentation which proved that the OKC bombing was not what it appeared to be. But he never had the chance to tell his side of the story, to blow the whistle on the things that he saw and experienced in the aftermath of that bombing. He died on the 8th of May, 1996. His death was ruled as suicide. So who was Terry Yeakey, and what did he know? Well, let's begin exploring that question by taking a look at a very important article from apfn.org, written by Pat Shannon, and titled simply enough, Who Killed Terry Yeakey? Quote, Terry Yeakey was a giant of a man, with a heart as big as the rest of him. I wish I had known him. He was a crusader for truth. Whenever his name is mentioned, I think of the news photo of him sprinting down Northwest 5th Street towards the Murrah building on another of the many rescue missions he performed that ugly day. In his blue uniform, he tends to remind us of an NFL linebacker about to put the sack on an unfortunate quarterback, but this is quickly overridden by the grave concern on the face of a policeman in a panic to save lives. After numerous private investigators produced irrefutable evidence of multiple explosions, unexploded bombs being hauled away after the fact, and the complete and total incapability of an ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb to cause the kind of devastation seen in downtown Oklahoma City, a giant government cover-up became obvious. Only a couple of hours into the rescue, Sergeant Terrance Yeakey became painfully aware of something disturbing. Did he somehow figure out that the building had been blown up from the inside and that the news reports were baloney? Did he overhear a strange conversation from some of the many ATF agents who were on the scene sooner than they should have been? Whatever it was, Terry was upset. He called his wife that morning crying. The big old teddy bear of a guy was crying and saying repeatedly, "It's not true. It's not what they are saying. It didn't happen that way." Terry Yeakey may have been the first to discover the sham. He ran back and forth into that concrete mess of bricks and mortar all day long and continued beyond exhaustion far into the night. He scraped and crawled and dug until his fingers bled and then kept digging some more. In a cadre of heroes that day, Terry's performance was outstanding. On May 11th, the following year, he was scheduled to receive the Medal of Valor from the Oklahoma City Police Department. He never got it. He was murdered on May 8th, 1996 in the country, 2.5 miles west of the El Reno Penitentiary. No homicide investigation was ever conducted, and there was no autopsy. In an interview with Terry's widow, Tanya Yeakey revealed that her husband had been very upset by something he had seen under the daycare center on April 19th. He had wanted to go back and photograph it, but the officials would not let him onto the site again. The Oklahoma Building Investigation Committee speculates that what Terry saw may have coincided with the possible evidence of another unreported bombing device uncovered by their science people. Mrs. Yeakey also said that Terry was supposed to be decorated for his work as a rescue person, but didn't want to be put in the limelight. Terry felt the investigation was fraudulent and didn't like the fact that the OKPD was honoring people who really weren't deserving of the honor. Sergeant Yeakey had told his friends that he was going out of town to hide or secure evidence of a cover-up of the bombing by federal agents. It was his day off, and he was traveling in his private automobile. In his last known conversation, Terry reportedly told a friend that he was being followed by the feds and had to shake them. Previously, his household had been subjected to numerous threatening phone calls by persons unknown, threats which have not ceased even with his death. Tanya Yeakey has moved 5 times in 3 years since the Oklahoma City tragedy. She continues to get intimidating letters and threatening phone calls. Since her husband's death, her home has been broken into and personal threats have been written on her living room walls. She remains in fear of her life, constantly seeking asylum with no place to turn. End quote. Well, that is as good an introduction as any, I suppose, to the mystery of what Terry Yeakey may have uncovered on that 19th day of April 1995, as he struggled, toiled, and sweated to rescue life after life after life from that burning, twisted rubble of the Alfred P. Murrah building. What was it that Terry Yeakey found? What was it that he saw that completely destroyed for him the myth that the media then propounded about the OKC bombing? To do justice to Terrance Yeakey's life is to explore the unfortunate details of his death, because there is no doubt that what he saw on that 19th day of April 1995 was connected inexorably to his death on the 8th of May 1996. To begin exploring this, first, let's listen to an extended excerpt from that conversation mentioned in that APFN article between Terrance Yeakey's wife, Tanya Yeakey, and Ken Rank and Craig Roberts of AM 1300 KAKC, from a conversation that they had about Terrance Yeakey's life and death in 1998.
Well, now she's on it. Good morning, Tanya.
Good morning.
Well, I've given them a little bit of a preview in the first hour of the case itself, just the basics of what happened and what you can do. We've got an hour, and what you can do is kind of fill us in on where you were at, what happened through your perspective, and especially what happened to you. Not only during the time of the bombing and shortly after, but all the way up until like today. So why don't you start with, let's back up just a little bit and take about 5 minutes first and tell us that, Terry was the first officer in the building. He probably saw some things that were dangerous for someone to see and remember and know, and he began working the case. And why don't you just kind of take it to there? What did he tell you?
Well, it actually started the day of the bombing that he had made some strange statements that at first I wasn't able to really put into any kind of logical order, but later on it began to make sense why he was making these comments. I picked him up. I got a call about 11:30, maybe 11:15 the morning of the bombing from Presbyterian Hospital. They said Terry had been injured, and I needed to come down there and get him. In that 2-hour time, I'd been trying to find him. His computer in his police vehicle was not working. Nobody could get a hold of him. Nobody seemed to know where he was. So I was really concerned because I knew he worked that area early in the morning, so I was concerned and was relieved to get the call. So I went down there to Presbyterian Hospital, picked him up. The strange thing was his first statement that came out of his mouth was, "Get me out of this hospital. No matter what you got to do, get me out of here." I said, okay. He's very adamant. I didn't know at the time that I've been told later that he was threatened at the hospital. I didn't know where the source of threatening came, but that's what I've been told later on, about a year after his death. As soon as we got in the vehicle, and Terry had injured his back carrying Randy Ledger out of the building. Randy was a large man, probably almost 300 pounds, and he had fallen through some rubble. So he couldn't even walk, couldn't sit up. And as soon as they loaded him into the car, he got very upset, started to cry a little bit and said, Tanya, it's not what they're saying it is. They're not telling the truth. They're lying about what's going on down there. And I did try to press him a little bit, ask him questions, but he didn't seem very willing to talk about it. It was just kind of a comment, it's not what they're portraying it to be. From that point on, it was about 2 or 3 days later, after the bombing, he had asked me to take him down to the site. And mind you, Terry couldn't even walk. He really was not in any shape to go down there. But he kept insisting we needed to go back down there. Said that we needed to go at night when we could not be seen. And people would just recognize us easily. And I didn't understand the reason for that, but I didn't ask a lot of questions either because he just seemed unwilling to give a lot of information. We did go down there, probably between 9:30, 10 o'clock. And he said that we were going to go look underneath where the daycare had been. There was something he wanted to see under there and get a picture if possible. As we went down there, we were stopped, and I can't remember which personnel it was, but I know definitely it was either ATF or FBI. I just cannot recall what the name was on the back of his jacket, but it was one of the two. And Terry had attempted to badge his way through, and the guy told him no. Then he said something a little more specific, like, you're not supposed to be back down here, something along the lines that made me realize the two of them recognized each other, and the interaction was very antagonistic. I think had I not been with Terry, he would have said a little more to the man, and maybe been a little more forceful about getting through, but it seemed like he thought better about it since I was with him, and we left. And then he asked me as we got in the car that I not be seen down at the site. And mind you, I worked a job that might require me to go down to the site. But I did not because he was very adamant that I not be seen down there at any point in time. The entire year after that was lots of strange incidences, lots of strange comments from him. About 15 days after the bombing happened, I got a call from his supervisor, Lieutenant Joanne Randall. And she was being pretty hostile, pretty aggressive, and asked me where Terry was, told her he was not there. And she said, you tell Terry that if he doesn't get that other report in, that he's going to be reprimanded if he does not get that in by the end of the night.
Who was this?
This is Lieutenant Joanne Randall, and this was his supervisor, direct supervisor at the time. Now, let me give you a little filler in there. In this time frame, Terry had written a 9-page report. I know that he wrote a 9-page report. I saw it. This is the only report, however, that I've ever asked him to read that he did not let me. I didn't understand the reason for that at the time. It was, I've ridden with my husband, on ride-alongs. We talk a lot about what had happened at work. I've read reports about the prostitutes on 9th and Francis, just meaning that nothing was really all that sacred. If I asked about it, usually he was pretty forthcoming in telling me about it. This time it was an absolute no. He didn't want me reading this 9-page report. And that's an awfully long report. I don't ever know too many police incident reports that are that long, but his was.
As you look back on that, do you find that as his way of protecting you by making sure that you didn't have that knowledge?
That's what I believe. That is what I believe. At the time, it was strange to me, but 2 years later, it comes into perspective really clear that he did not want me to have any knowledge of what was going on down there.
Okay, so now she wants a second report.
She wants a second report. And like I said, this is not hearsay. I got the call. I know what she said to him. He had told me, and I want to say it was maybe, about the 11th or 12th day that he had came into the house and was really upset, just mad. Said that they supposedly lost his first report. It was just missing. He was furious. And another thing that was very unlike him, that he would not keep a copy of the report, but I think because he had been injured and probably was not expecting that the report would come up missing, I think he probably would have made a copy under normal circumstances. but he seemed offended, and he had said that she wanted him to write a much shorter report. It needed to be 1 page. He was being dictated, obviously, what to write in his report and being told to take a lot of things out of it.
Now, people have to understand that when you turn a report in, first thing it does, it goes to your supervisor, then it goes to Records Division, and they make multiple copies for various locations. So to lose the report, the supervisor would have to lose it, or they would have to go to these multiple locations that they know the report's at and get rid of all the reports.
Right.
Now, they want a second report. That lends me to believe that they want a different report, because they've already threatened him by now.
Yes.
And so now they say, that's not the report we want. You'll write it, but you'll leave out such and such. That's my theory.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
And I agree with that for certain reasons of other things that had gone on. I know Terry was being threatened with disciplinary action all over the place for lots of things concerning the bombing. They won't fess to this, but this, in fact, was occurring. And the report was the first thing that I know about, that he was threatened with disciplinary action. Okay, I'm trying to get my train of thought here. And, jump in, ask me any questions you want as I'm going along.
I'll help you on this, since I know the story. Not as well as you, but fairly well.
Let me ask one quick question. Tanya, have you ever told this story before on radio?
Yes, I have.
Oh, you have?
Yes, I have.
Did you have any reaction from it?
I'm sorry?
Did you have any particular reaction from it?
Particular reaction
As
from
in
it?
threats, telephone problems, takeouts, whatever.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've gotten used to it over 2 years, It doesn't seem so new to me anymore.
Did you do this at an Oklahoma City station?
No, I have not. This is the first time I've been able to do it in any Oklahoma City radio station.
Oh, in any Oklahoma station at all?
That's correct.
Oh,
it's always been on shortwave and national stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. In other words, a very limited listenership.
Did any stations turn you down? Would they not let you tell this story, or what?
When Terry's death first happened, and I had to do a lot of digging to find out what happened to Terry, okay? I was really kind of armed with some vague information at the time, mostly because of how the body actually was when it was found, with the location it was found. Just the whole story itself was unbelievable. And I had not pinpointed it all to the bombing until about a year after. I was still kind of gathering and kind of blindly searching my way through it. So,
yeah, that sounds like maybe you had some of the same problems Karen Silkwood had.
Yeah. Now, getting on with you mentioned to me that Terry had come to you on probably more than one occasion and said, we need to get remarried so you'll be covered by insurance and pension and all this for the kids?
Yes.
Okay.
We had been divorced at that time. It was about 2 weeks after before his death that he suddenly became very afraid, very anxious, very nervous. I would not say suicidal, just afraid. And he would come to my house at strange times of the night, unannounced. And this is, if you knew Terry Yeakey, you'd know how out of character this would be. Terry was a polite sort, very respectful. Wouldn't even come over unless, you knew he was coming in advance. But here he was coming up at my door 2 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 in the morning. And he was telling me that he was going to get his insurance papers all put together and make sure that I had them. He wanted me to leave in the middle of the night with him right then. He said, we need to get remarried. Don't ask me questions. This is the only way I can make sure you and the girls are taken care of in the event that something happens to me.
But that never happened.
That never happened.
You never got the paperwork, or it was never done.
No,
Okay.
Because it was, it had started, like I said, 2 weeks beforehand, and he was very vague in what he said, and I spent several hours trying to get him to tell me what was going on. Very frustrating, but it was obvious that there was something going on. I don't believe he was suicidal, but 2 days before it, he showed up again, and he did something very strange. He tossed a VCR in my car, did not explain why, said that he needed to get these insurance papers to me, and left. Said he would be back. Very upset. 48 hours later, he was dead. It was the last time I ever saw it.
Now, you said VCR is in a machine or a VHS tape?
No, a VCR machine,
Okay.
an entire machine.
Okay.
Which, like I said, yeah, if it were you, you think, what in the world? What is he doing?
It wasn't a camcorder. It was a VCR.
It was VCR, and there had been a tape in it, but I have not watched it. The VCR came up missing within 24 hours.
Oh.
It disappeared out of my house. So I was more concerned at the time of what he was talking about than I was, because the VCR was kind of incidental and didn't mean a lot to me at the time. When I went back to look at it, to look for it, it had turned up missing.
And there you go. There's Tonya Yeakey talking with Craig Roberts and Ken Rand about the life and death of Terry Yeakey. And I would wholeheartedly suggest that people follow the link to the YouTube video from which I scraped that audio so that you can listen to the entire conversation, which is about an hour long and goes into much greater detail about the harassment that the Yeakeys were receiving and, of course, about the grisly details of Terrance Yeakey's death. Now, this is never a fun part of any episode, but it needs to be done. We have to examine the scene of Terrance Yeakey's death to find out more about what was labeled a suicide, but which absolutely on its face could not possibly have been a suicide. And to get into the ugly details of that grisly scene, let's take a listen to a clip from a very valuable 10-minute YouTube documentary put together by We Are Change Oklahoma under the title We Are Change Oklahoma. What did Sergeant Terrance Yeakey know? Now, this is a very valuable documentary that came out earlier this year. It's 10 minutes long and goes through the story of Terrance Yeakey and his death, and also interviews some of Terrance Yeakey's family members about their comments about what has been labeled a suicide, but which virtually no one believes was actually a suicide. So let's listen to a short clip from this We Are Change Oklahoma video in which they discuss the scene of Terrance Yeakey's death.
Sergeant Yeakey had witnessed things during his response to the bombing which did not agree with the official version of events touted by the national media and law enforcement at that time. He was in the process of collecting evidence which supported and documented the inconsistencies he witnessed the morning of the bombing at the scene itself. According to the Yeakey family members, Terrance Yeakey was to meet a colleague in the restaurant directly behind me the morning of May 8 of 1996. He was to discuss records that he had collected regarding the Oklahoma City bombing, which were stored in a storage facility about an hour's drive north of here. Terrance Yeakey never made it to that restaurant in El Reno because on the morning of May 8 of 1996 at 7 a.m., his vehicle was found in a spot just behind me by a resident living up this road no more than a mile away. It was from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. that the car would sit here, full of blood, and according to Terry's sister Vicky, there was actually blood in between the window panes in the back of the vehicle. In addition to the blood, there was an unidentified knife found in the bottom of the glove box, along with razor blades, the car keys, and the windows rolled up tight. The car was locked. Terry's body was nowhere to be found. Until later that evening, between 7 and 8 p.m., OCPD helicopters, in addition to the Canadian County Sheriff, as well as El Reno Police, would have a large search party looking for Terry's body no more than a half a mile from where we're standing. It is important to note exactly how Yeakey is supposed to have killed himself. He was said to have slit his wrists and neck, causing him to nearly bleed to death in his car and then miraculously climb over a barbed wire fence. He then was purported to have walked over 1¼ mile distance through a nearby field, eventually shooting himself in the head at an unusual angle. Startlingly, no weapon was found at the scene of the body, no investigation was conducted, no fingerprints taken, and no interviews with family members or friends were conducted to try and determine why Yeakey would have been suicidal, or if he had in fact been suicidal at all. Instead, the conclusion that Yeakey's death was a suicide was reached immediately without an autopsy.
Again, quite a grisly scene, but it bears repeating exactly what we are being asked to believe was a suicide. So apparently, Sergeant Terrance Yeakey slashed himself several times on the forearms and then cut his own throat twice near the jugular vein, then crawled a mile through rough terrain away from his car, which he had the presence of mind to lock after leaving, before shooting himself in the head with a small caliber revolver, somehow along the way managing to get rope burns, or what appeared to be rope burns, on his neck, as well as handcuff bruises on his wrists, muddy grass embedded in his slash wounds, and then somehow managed to dispose of the suicide weapon in a way that it was not found at the scene. It was later found by an FBI investigator after several people had gone over the scene of his death with a fine-tooth comb. Well, if you have been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you know what this is called. This is not a suicide. This is someone who has been suicided. Just as Gary Webb could not possibly have shot himself twice in the head, as is alleged by the people who would like to label his death as a suicide and thus sweep under the rug all of the valuable work that he did exposing CIA drug running, so too would they like us to believe that Terrance Yeaky butchered himself and then shot himself in the head and then disposed of the weapon, all in the name of discrediting the very person who could have proven that there was something very wrong with the official story of the OKC bombing. Earlier this week, I had the chance to talk to James Lane of We Are Change Oklahoma. Let's listen to a clip from my interview with James Lane, which of course is available for download in its entirety from CorbettReport.com, in which we talk about the work of We Are Change Oklahoma in continuing to expose the truth about the Oklahoma City bombing in general and the death of Terrance Yeaky in particular. Well, tell us a little bit about your own involvement with this story, how you came, obviously, to start with the OKC bombing in general and specifically this case, and tell us a little bit about meeting the family of Terrance Yeaky.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'm born and raised here in Oklahoma, and it's always been something that's, obviously when an event like that happens in your home city, you feel that, you want to investigate it more. And I think a lot of people may have just turned away from it because it was so horrific and they just wanted to put it behind them. But I wanted to know more about it. And after getting involved with We Are Change, I said, well, We Are Change Oklahoma needs to make the Oklahoma City bombing, I think, the primary focus. The New York chapters, they deal with the events of September 11th, but it seemed like, I guess, a lot of time had passed from Oklahoma City. But, there's a lot of information there that needs to be, told. So we put together a trifold flyer that we hand out at the bombing memorial to try to raise awareness and drive folks to, the websites that we have. We're trying to get folks to understand that this could happen again. And we're not saying the government did anything. I don't think the government can even run the post office. But we have evidence of foreknowledge within certain elements of agencies that's, at this point, needs to be investigated. And you've got senior officials of the Clinton administration saying that the only thing that's going to save Obama is another Oklahoma City or 9/11. Those are scary words.
Absolutely. It certainly is. And I think for anyone who has spent any time researching it, they'll see all of the various foreknowledge and provocateurship of the various agencies that were supposedly afflicted on that day, including, of course, the ATF. But absolutely, it's an extremely important case, and it continues to be one as we move into a new age of potential Oklahoma City-type bombings, and we hear the rhetoric of that increasing. So tell us, I understand you're working on a documentary about the Oklahoma City bombing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. We've started on a documentary film. Our company is called Free Mind Films. It can be found at freemindfilms.com. And the movie is going to be called A Noble Lie, because that is from Plato's The Republic. And a noble lie is a lie that is knowingly told by the elite in order to maintain social harmony or their position social status. And we think that that is relevant here because we saw a lot of people that, whether or not they were part of the planning or any of that, we're not saying that, but they were complicit in the cover-up. They used the event to their own benefit. This tragedy, these people, real people died that day, and you got Bill Clinton running around saying that's what got him reelected. So because everybody, they really focus on the September 11th events, and everybody has a lot of knowledge about that, but it seems like the Oklahoma City bombing, maybe so much time has passed, we need to revisit it, because there are some of the most glaring examples of cover-up there that we don't see that, and they got the more sophisticated in cover up with 9/11, whereas Oklahoma City, I mean, it's just very blatant, and we think that it's time that the story be told. And that's why we're getting the interviews. We're talking with Terrance Yeakey's family. We got interested in his case initially because we found out he was one of the first responders, and that's where we got into the nitrous gas cloud. I mean, for me, that was one of the major pieces of evidence that show that the official story is not true. I mean, there's mountains of evidence beyond that. You had the largest manhunt in history for John Doe number 2, and then all of a sudden we're just supposed to ignore that and act like that didn't happen. They said that the people were confused at the Ryder truck rental place. Well, they only rent a couple of trucks a day. It's not a high traffic office, and I don't think that they're going to be confused about who came in with who and at what time. And it wasn't like a lot of time had passed. They were questioned 48 hours after he had rented the truck. So, I mean, multiple witnesses. We've got 23 affidavits where people saw Timothy McVeigh with another man. This can't be denied. And the FBI just acts like, well, it didn't happen.
Absolutely. And of course, there are so many aspects to this case. And as I've gone through on my podcast before, and as I know you talk about quite a bit in the various media that you do. But obviously, one of the linchpins of that case is the Terrance Yeakey death, which was so obviously not what it was portrayed to be. And just one more time, tell us about meeting the family and what that was like.
Absolutely. It was difficult. I mean, there were some of the most kind, loving people that I've met. I mean, they just welcomed us into their home. I think that they were grateful that someone, it was trying to dig into this because they had been fighting for so long and had been told no and turned away so many times. They really showed us a lot of kindness and love. So it was really difficult to listen to the family, recount the death of their loved one. It was just, his mother, Ludella, she says, it's very painful to go over it time and time again, but she vowed that she would not give up until the truth was known about the death of her son. His sisters they're great ladies and very, very brave in what they're trying to do. And they are still going down to try to get his belongings. I mean, that was just something that happened recently. I mean, they had his weapon in storage for all these years. So right now they're trying to get the investigation going, and that costs money, and that's why it's taken so long. But there are some people that are interested, have agreed to come on board and pursue this case.
For anyone who has been involved in this research for any length of time, you will have no doubt encountered the old refrain, "I don't believe in conspiracies because someone would have talked." Well, Gary Webb attempted to talk, and he was suicided. Terrance Yeakey attempted to talk, and he was suicided. Many, many others have also attempted to tell the truth, and they have been disposed of in like manner. But suffice it to say that to honor the memory of those who have fallen in attempting to expose the truth, we must take up that torch and continue to expose the truth and shine the light of the truth on those dark corners that the dark operators would like to keep in the dark. In this way, we can honor those who have fallen in the pursuit of truth and justice. I leave today's final words to Terrance Yeakey's own grandmother from the We Are Change Oklahoma video about Terrance Yeakey's death.
there were lies told about everything that happened. And I would like for the world to know that his life was just taken away from him for nothing.